The Texas air that day was heavy, thick with the heat of a sun that seemed intent on cooking the very earth. But it wasn't the heat that made sweat stream down Josiah Houston Barrett's brow. It was the cold, dark barrel of a rifle held by one of Colonel Seth Coleman Chambers' men less than a handspan from his face. The sound of the colonel's horses trampling the dry soil of his ranch was like a profanation, an insult to every grain of dust his father had defended with his own life. Chambers, astride his black stallion, held a paper with an air of sickly triumph. The official government seal gleamed, a lustrous lie under the unforgiving sun. "The law is clear, Barrett," the colonel said, his voice as smooth as a rattlesnake's before it strikes. "This land now belongs to the Western Development Company. You have until sunset to remove your belongings, or what's left of them." Josiah didn't look at the paper. His eyes were locked on Chambers, a gaze that held no fear, but an ancient, patient fury. He wasn't a man of many words, but his silence screamed louder than any protest. This piece of ground wasn't just land, it was a testament. It was where his mother had planted the rose bushes that still stubbornly bloomed, where he and his father had built the barn, beam by beam, promise by promise. It was payment for a kind of loyalty men like Chambers would never understand. A quick flashback, almost a ghost in the dust, flashed through his mind. He was a 10-year-old boy, sitting beside his father on the porch, listening to tales of a distant war. "This land, Josiah," his father had said, his voice hoarse with weariness and pride, "wasn't bought with gold. It was paid for with courage. I fought alongside good men, true men. One of them, a fellow from Tennessee, used to say a man should be sure he's right, and then go ahead." The name of the Tennessee man was a legend, a sacred whisper. Josiah felt the weight of that name on his shoulders now. He had known for months that Chambers' shadow was spreading across the county. Neighbors had been intimidated, others simply disappeared, their lands absorbed by the colonel's company. He himself had ignored the signs, believing in justice, in the honor that should govern that new nation. He believed the flag his father had fought for still protected the righteous. What naivety! Faith, he realized, was a luxury the honest couldn't always afford. "Your father was an idealistic fool, just like you," Chambers continued, as if reading his thoughts. "He died for a patch of dirt and a dream. I am a man of facts, of progress." He gestured to one of his henchmen, who dismounted and, with the butt of his rifle, smashed one of the house windows. The sound of shattering glass was like a shot to Josiah's heart. It was his mother's bedroom window. The colonel smiled, a thin, cruel smile. Progress is sometimes noisy. Josiah clenched his fists, his knuckles white. Violence simmered beneath his skin. A storm, contained by a dam of sheer willpower. Attacking would be suicide, and it would be exactly what Chambers wanted. He needed an excuse to kill him right there and turn the land seizure into an act of order maintenance. The colonel, pleased with Josiah's submissive silence, turned his horse. "Until sunset, Barrett. Don't make me come back." As Chambers' entourage rode away, kicking up a cloud of dust that seemed to mock Josiah's helplessness, he remained motionless. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and blood. Each dying ray of light on the horizon seemed to carry a piece of his hope. He looked at his home, violated, at the ground, sacred, and at the distant hills where his father was buried. A promise made to a dying man echoed in his soul. "Take care of this land, son. It's more than our home. It's proof it was worth it." Chambers chuckled as he left the property, thinking he had broken a man. He saw only a lone rancher, an insignificant, obstacle in his path to power and wealth. But what he didn't know was that in Texas, when you take everything from a good man, you don't leave him with nothing. You leave him free. Free from fear, free from the rules of cowards, free to do what it takes. And as the hot desert wind blew over the wounded ranch, it carried not a sound of defeat, but the harbinger of silent retribution. The colonel had just awakened a kind of man he didn't know, one who fights not for what he can gain, but for what he cannot afford to lose, honor. Injustice, once planted, takes deep and bitter roots. In the days that followed, Josiah Houston Barrett learned that lesson the hard way. He was forced to leave his ranch, taking with him little more than his horse's saddle, his mother's old Bible, and the burning memory of his humiliation. The town, which had once greeted him with respect, now averted its gaze. Fear was a poison that Colonel Chambers knew how to administer in precise doses. The sheriff, a man who had once shared a drink with Josiah's father, now merely shrugged, his eyes fixed on the ground. It's orders from above, Josiah. Progress needs room. Chambers' progress was a plague. He erected barbed wire fences where there had once been open range, diverted a creek to supply his operations, leaving other families with dry wells and thirsty livestock. His arrogance was boundless, fueled by the certainty of impunity. He held lavish dinners at his new headquarters, the former home of a neighbor of Josiah's, and toasted to the future of Texas, a future where the law was whatever he said it was. For Josiah, each day was a new step down into hell. He slept in the barn of an old family friend, Virginia Ross, a widow with a steady gaze and resilient heart, whose ranch was next on the colonel's list. He worked for food, mending fences and breaking horses, but dishonor followed him like a shadow. Children in the street would sometimes point at him, whispering, "That's the man who lost his land." Each whisper was like a goad. It was on one of those dark nights, in the silence of the barn that smelled of hay and old gunpowder, that the memory of his father returned with painful clarity. This time, the flashback was sharper. His father was cleaning his rifle, the same one now in Josiah's hands. "You know, son," he said without looking up, "in war, you quickly learn the difference between a leader and a tyrant. I saw generals in immaculate uniforms who sent men to their deaths out of vanity. And I saw men in ragged clothes like Crockett, who inspired courage just by their gaze. He didn't fight for land, son. He fought for the idea of land, for a man's right to call a place his own, look up at the sky, and owe allegiance to no king or colonel." In that moment, Josiah understood. The fight wasn't for a piece of ground. It was for the soul of Texas. It was to defend the promise for which men like Crockett and his father had died. It was to ensure their sacrifice hadn't been in vain, that it wouldn't be erased by the greed of a man like Seth Coleman Chambers. This revelation changed something within him. Humiliation gave way to a cold, calm, blind rage transformed into a sharp purpose. He began to observe. He stopped cursing his fate and started studying his enemy. He noticed the way the colonel disdained his own men, the way he blindly trusted documents and seals, his arrogant faith in the power of paper over the power of the people. He saw the anxiety in the town clerk's eyes whenever Chambers was around, the way the man sweated when handling land records, small cracks in the colonel's wall of power. Virginia Ross, who watched him with the wisdom of one who had seen many winters, noticed the change. "Hate burns fast, Josiah," she told him one evening, handing him a plate of hot stew, "but justice needs a slow fire." Josiah merely nodded, his eyes fixed on a distant point. The colonel, confident of his victory, didn't know that, but all. Driving Josiah Barrett from his ranch, he hadn't just created an enemy. He had forged a weapon. Every insult, every slammed door, every look of pity or contempt only tempered the steel of his determination. With each humiliation, something new grew within him, something that became stronger than fear, more patient than time, and more dangerous than any rifle. Darkness became Josiah's ally. While Colonel Chambers toasted his power under the chandeliers of his stolen home, Josiah moved through the shadows, not as an outlaw, but as a ghost in search of truth. His first step was to visit Virginia Ross, no longer as a broken man seeking shelter, but as a strategist seeking an arsenal. And Virginia's arsenal was not of weapons, but of memory. My late husband, God rest his soul, was a meticulous man, she said, opening a heavy cedar chest in the corner of her parlor. He believed the history of Texas was written not just on battlefields, but in record books. From within the chest, she pulled out a large leather-bound book, its pages yellowed by time. The county's master book, with every original land grant signed and sealed before men like Chambers learned to turn the law into a weapon against the honest. For nights on end, by the light of an oil lamp, the two pored over the book. Josiah, with his memory of the land, and Virginia, with her knowledge of names and families. They traced the lineage of every property Chambers had taken, comparing signatures and seals. Josiah's intelligence, once used to predict the weather or find the best pasture, was now focused on deciphering the anatomy of fraud. He noticed a pattern. All the colonel's deeds used a slightly different legal phrasing and a state seal that, while appearing authentic, had a minuscule flaw in the central star. A small victory, but one that ignited a flame of hope. The next step was riskier. He needed concrete proof. Knowing the town clerk was Chambers' weak point, Josiah didn't confront him. Instead, he used compassion. He learned that the clerk's wife was ill, and he was deep in debt to the colonel's store. One night, Josiah left a bag of silver coins on the man's doorstep, along with an anonymous note. For your wife's health, honor is priceless. 2 days later, a package was left at the barn where Josiah slept. Inside were copies of letters between Chambers and his associates in Austin, detailing the scheme to forge the seals and legitimize the fraudulent deeds. The clerk, touched by the act of anonymous kindness in a world of brutality, had risked everything to give Josiah the ammunition he needed. But the letters and the record book weren't enough. They proved fraud, but Josiah needed something that spoke not just to the law, but to the heart of the Texan people. He needed a symbol, and it was then he remembered the most precious item his father had left him, something he had saved from the ranch that fateful afternoon, the old family Bible. He opened it. The pages were worn, marked by generations of hands. Between the pages of the book of Psalms, he found it. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the original grant of his land, written on parchment, the ink faded but still legible. It bore the original seal of the Republic of Texas, unblemished, and at the bottom, a personal notation, almost illegible, written by a superior officer to his father, a private, and then the signature that served as a witness. The name that was more than a name, it was an oath. Crockett. With the parchment in hand, a plan began to take shape, a daring plan that didn't rely on gunpowder, but on courage and the power of truth. He knew the colonel was planning a grand public auction to sell the recovered lands, including his own. It would be the pinnacle of his triumph, an event to solidify his dominion over the county. For Josiah, it would be the perfect stage. While the town slept under the yoke of fear, in Virginia Ross's small house, by the light of a single candle. Truth was being rediscovered. Chambers controlled the rifles, the judges, and the money. But Josiah was about to wield a far more powerful weapon: memory. The powerful laughed, thinking he had given up, that he was just another broken rancher. Little did they know that silence was merely the sound that precedes lightning. The day of the auction dawned clear and unforgiving, the Texas sun illuminating the town square like a spotlight on a stage. Colonel Seth Coleman Chambers was at the height of his glory. Mounted on a makeshift platform, he reveled in the presence of the region's wealthy men, the politicians he had bought, and the common people whose fear was the spice of his victory. The auctioneer began to call out the lots. The lands of dispossessed families sold for a fraction of their value to the colonel's cronies. The air was heavy with a collective humiliation. Then, as the auctioneer announced the next item, the old Barrett Ranch, a prime property, now free of encumbrance, a lone figure emerged from the crowd. It was Josiah Houston Barrett. He carried no rifle. There was no anger on his face, only a supernatural calm that silenced the square's murmur. In his hands, he held his family's old Bible. Chambers smirked disdainfully. "Came to say your final prayers, Barrett? A bit late for salvation, don't you think?" Josiah ignored the insult. He walked firmly to the platform, his gaze passing over Chambers and settling on the state commissioner, a man sent from Austin to oversee the auction, a bureaucrat who, above all, feared a scandal. "Mr. Commissioner," Josiah said, his voice clear and firm, echoing in the tense silence, "I ask only for a moment, not to contest the law, but to honor the history upon which this law was built." Intrigued and feeling the eyes of the entire town upon him, the commissioner nodded. Josiah opened the Bible. With reverent care, he withdrew the yellowed parchment. "This is the original deed to my land, granted to my father for his service to the Republic of Texas." He handed it to the commissioner, who examined it with skepticism. Josiah then turned to Chambers. "And this," he said, pointing to the document the colonel proudly displayed, "is a forgery." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Chambers turned purple with rage. "Nonsense! The state seal is there. It's a legal document." "The state seal," Josiah said calmly, "has a perfect 5-pointed star. Your seal has a tiny flaw in the upper tip, a flaw that repeats on every deed you've used to steal our neighbors' lands." He then produced the copies of the letters the clerk had given him from his pocket and handed them to the commissioner. The man's face paled as he recognized the names and the nature of the correspondence. Desperation began to dawn in Chambers' eyes. He tried to signal his men, but they hesitated, confused, sensing the tide turning. But Josiah's final blow was yet to come. He took the parchment back from the commissioner's trembling hands. "But the ultimate proof isn't in seals or letters," he said, turning to the people. "It's here." He read the notation at the bottom, his voice cracking for the first time. "To Private Barrett, for his bravery at San Jacinto, may this land be a home for the freedom for which you bled." He paused, letting the words echo. Then he looked directly at Chambers, the cold contempt in his eyes. This document, this sacred promise, was signed and witnessed by a man whose name this state was built upon, a man who died so that scoundrels like you couldn't steal what he gave us. He raised the parchment for all to see the faded signature, and then he spoke the name. His name was Crockett. A deep, reverent silence fell over the square. The name wasn't just a word, it was thunder. It was the Alamo. It was San Jacinto. It was the very soul of Texas. In that instant, Chambers' power evaporated. His men backed away. The politicians distanced themselves from him. The crowd, once paralyzed by fear, now looked at him with a burning contempt. To invoke Crockett's name in that way was more than an accusation of fraud. It was an accusation of heresy. The commissioner, seeing his career on the line, acted swiftly. "Colonel Chambers, you are under investigation for fraud and conspiracy against the people of Texas. Guards, arrest this man." That day, no bullets were fired. Justice came not from the barrel of a gun, but from the rustle of a yellowed page and the weight of a name worth more than all the armies of Mexico. The colonel was defeated not by a cowboy, but by history. And as he was led away, shackled and humiliated, the crowd didn't cheer. They simply took off their hats in silence, a gesture of respect, not for the fall of a tyrant, but for the courage of an ordinary man who reminded them of what it truly meant to be a Texan. The dust Colonel Chambers kicked up as he was led away settled slowly, and with it, the fear that had hung over the county. Justice, once set in motion, ran its relentless course. The stolen lands were returned to their rightful owners. Chambers' paper empire crumbled, and his name, once feared, became a shameful footnote in local history, a cautionary tale of hubris. He was exiled from his own ambitions, imprisoned not in a stone cell, but in the prison of his own failure and oblivion. Josiah Houston Barrett did not partake in the celebrations. He sought no praise nor reward. The day after the auction, he simply saddled his horse and rode back home. The ranch was wounded, the broken window a reminder of the violation, but the spirit of the place was intact. The wind that blew through the hills seemed cleaner. The ground beneath his feet felt firmer. He had won not because he was stronger or faster, but because he was just, faithful, and clever. He understood that true strength lay not in subjugating others, but in standing firm for what you believe in. In the weeks that followed, neighbors came to help him rebuild. They brought lumber for the barn, seeds for planting, and most importantly, they brought back the respect that had been stolen from him. They saw in Josiah not a legendary hero, but something more real and inspiring, proof that a simple man's honor could indeed move mountains. The justice he achieved was not just personal. It reignited a flame in the hearts of the community. People began to look each other in the eye again, to speak with their heads held high. The Texan spirit, dormant under the weight of intimidation, awoke. They remembered that freedom is not a gift, but a daily responsibility, a garden that must be tended and defended against the weeds of tyranny. A year later, Josiah sat on the porch, the same one where his father had told him stories of courage. The window was repaired, his mother's rose bushes bloomed a vibrant red, and the sun set over a field of tall, healthy corn. Virginia Ross approached, carrying an apple pie. They sat in silence for a while, watching the colors of the sky. "He tried to destroy you," she said finally, her voice soft, "but he ended up destroying himself." Josiah nodded, a faint smile on his face. In Texas, Virginia, true revenge isn't seeing the enemy fall. It's living free when he lives bound to his own past. He never became a famous figure. His name wasn't etched into history books like that of the man who inspired him. But to the families of that valley, to the children who now grew up hearing his story, Josiah Houston Barrett was living proof that Crockett's spirit didn't die at the Alamo. It lived and still lives in every honest man who refuses to kneel, in every brave woman who preserves memory, in every piece of land defended not with violence, but with an unwavering faith in justice. Freedom comes at a price, but those who fight with honor and conviction are never forgotten. Texas doesn't belong to those who command, who shout the loudest or who hold the most power. It belongs to those who remain. If you were moved by this story of courage and justice and believe that the values of honor and freedom should be celebrated, subscribe to our channel. Share this video with everyone who is proud of their roots and their history. And don't forget to comment from what part of the world you're watching. We want to know where the spirit of Texas finds a home.